Good evening, everybody. Again, this is week 1 in world history. And as I said yesterday in my introductory video, I just want to go over chapters 19 and 20 with you. Just kind of an overarching view of the chapters. And in doing so, I'm just going to hit the highlights of each of these two chapters. And so you'll notice there, in the very first of each chapter, you've got some learning outcomes for each of those chapters. I highly encourage you to be familiar with those, but also to be able to answer those questions should they come up in some form of your exam, and they'll also help you as you prepare and study for your exam. And so the first part of this looks at the Iberian Peninsula. And when we think about the Iberian Peninsula, we're talking about Spain and Portugal. And it talks about their quest to build overseas empires. Now, these were the first two countries that, at least for Europe, really began to explore the world. Italy had done so, but remember, in this time period, Italy is not a unified nation. Italy is made up of several little independent nations. So there's really not the backing that you would need from a large monarchy or a large government in Italy, in the Italian states. But in Spain and Portugal, you do have that, particularly with the merger of Spain during this time period. The chapter also talks about Columbus and the voyage of Magellan. It talks about empire building. It talks about the interaction with the Americas and those countries. And then also looks at France and England and their impact. But the thing that I want to point out that a lot of times I think students miss is just how much this changed the worldview of a lot of Europeans, and really how they began to maybe see themselves in the context of society. They've gone from a period where they knew the existence of Asia, they knew the existence of Africa, and in some corners of Europe, yes, they knew that there was something over there, but they didn't know exactly what it was. We have records of Vikings sailing along the northeast coast of the United States and Canada. There's speculation, of course, the Chinese made contact with the American west coast at some point in time. But a systematic, thorough exploration of these lands had not occurred. And now all of a sudden it's happening. And what that must do to Europeans' mindset as they look out across the sky and the ocean and to think, hey, there's something else over there now. And really how it impacts them is not just in the worldview to think that they're not maybe the center of everything now, but also just, and as the last part of the chapter talks, the exchange of items. Your chapter talks about the Columbian exchange. It talks about the exchange of diseases. It talks about the exchange of food. It talks about the exchange of ideas. And one of the things I always ask students to consider is, yes, hundreds of millions of Native Americans died in South America and North America, most likely during this time period. But you also then ask the question, how was their life changed with the advantages in some respects that European items brought? And I just want you to consider a couple of things. The Western Hemisphere will be given wheat and corn. When we think about how important corn comes into the American Indian diet, we also think about that there are no horses in North or South America before the arrival of Europeans, and how that impacts their life, particularly on the American plains and the different Native American groups that use the horse in hunting and survival. So there's really that large interaction there. Then I also want to point out just real quickly how this impacts the European. And the one thing that I always talk about in here is corn. And potatoes. And in some respects, those two things saved European society. And it may sound funny to say that, but if you think about corn and potatoes, you can do several things with them. particularly corn. One, you can eat it. Two, you can feed it to your livestock, chickens, cattle, whatever it may be. And three, you can drink it, corn mash. And so it really is a food group that provides a lot of things to Europeans. Same with potatoes. Now, you're probably not going to feed potatoes to livestock, but you can eat them, and you can drink potato mash, make alcohol out of it. And so a lot of Europeans, these two things really influence their way of life going forward and how they saw things. But again, thinking about just the overall worldview of the Europeans, it's completely changed. It's completely shattered. And chapter 19 does a good job of talking about that interaction and how these foreign nations begin to first set up shop in the New World. If you then transition over into chapter 20, chapter 20 looks at an age in Europe where there's a lot of conflict. And a lot of that conflict has to do with expansion. Everybody wanted their fair share. Everybody wanted their part. But the other part of that conflict looks at religion. And you may ask the question, well, how do religion and chapter 19 go hand in hand? Well, if you go back and look at chapter 19, you look at particularly the Spanish and their quest to Catholicize the Native Americans and their attempt to really bring religion, at least their religion, to the Native Americans in Central America. In the American Southwest. I apologize, I was up late last night. But again, chapter 20 is a changing worldview for the Europeans. No longer are king and country all under the domain of the Catholic Church. You now have the Protestant Rebellion, the Protestant Reformation, if you will, that changes the entire landscape. And your textbook does a good job talking about Martin Luther. But it also talks then about why countries went one way or the other. And a lot of times people chose what religion their country was going to follow. And remember, at this point in time, if your king was Catholic, pretty much the entire country was going to be Catholic. If your king was Protestant, your country was going to be Protestant. And so for a ruler to choose a side, to choose Catholicism or some type of Protestant faith, that meant the entire country went that way. And we see wars in France and in Germany in particular that really focus on religion, that really look at, okay, how am I going to convince my people this is the best way? And in some cases, these wars of religion completely destroyed the country. France, for instance, was huge. In that they tried to play both sides, but in the end, what ultimately happens is that the Catholic monarchy kicks out all the Protestants. Well, that doesn't sound like a big deal, maybe, but most of the Protestants were your shop owners, your middle-class merchantmen. They controlled a lot of the income in France. And so if they're gone, a lot of your capital's gone. A lot of your free cash is gone, or your liquid cash is gone. And so to be able to do anything about it, it really becomes hard to run a country without that liquid cash, that liquid income to use. And then the chapter goes on to talk about, just again, the changing nature of European society and the changing worldview. Again, we're going from a continent that is entirely Catholic to one that is broken up. And then how that impacts their trade, how that impacts society. The chapter talks about warfare, disease, witch hunts. It talks about mercantilism. It talks about capitalism. It talks about the new products that were available to people. And the other thing to consider is a lot of this also then impacts the colonies. The United States, is, most of us who grew up here know about the witch hunts and the witch trials in Massachusetts in the 1600s. It's directly out of this. They're happening at the same time. And so, again, how is the European worldview changing? Or it's no longer, in some respects, based on religion. It's based on profit and capitalism. It's based on knowing that the Catholic leadership, at least from the Protestant point of view, is not infallible. They make mistakes. They make errors. And so having that function, sorry, my screen went blank, having that question now of what is right and wrong, and not just blindly following the church, is going to change the way that people interact. And so these two chapters, again, really change the Europeans' point of view. They change the Europeans' way of looking at things. And for a lot of Europeans, this is the progression into the early modern period. Because what happens next is a result of chapters 19 and 20. The wars of the countries, the unifications of countries, conflict between countries, all go back to these two chapters. And if you learn one thing in this class, understand that history is a story and that everything is cause and effect. Something caused something else to happen. It doesn't happen in isolation. There are consequences to the actions that we see. Well, again, this is just a brief overview. I hope this has kind of provided some context from looking at the chapter. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll speak with you again soon. Have a good evening.